Okay, looks like we can go ahead and get started. Uh, we're picking back up in Bobby Fischer's My 60 Most Memorable Games. Jack saying he thought it was Thursday. Yep, that's what happens sometimes. That is what happens. So here, Bobby Fischer is playing against Rossetto, Mar del Plata 1959, and this game took place in Argentina. He calls it an unpleasant obligation, the unpleasant obligation. And he says that this game exemplifies the German word Zugzwang. So we have some German viewers. Hopefully this lives up to the hype. So e4, c5, we have a Sicilian defense, knight to f3, e6, and Fischer played d4. We saw a game earlier last stream in which Fischer played d3 in this position and went into a King's Indian attack. So this is another thing that Fischer did, especially against the e6 variation, because if black now plays d5, we transpose into a King's Indian attack in the French. So it's almost as if black played e6, then d5, then c5. So that's why Fischer goes for this. But this time he decides to go for the open Sicilian with d4. And his opponent takes. Fischer takes back with the knight. Pawn to a6. So this is called the Khan variation in the Sicilian Khan. And here white has a couple of different options. Usually against these e6 Sicilians, it's not such a good idea to go for the typical setup of knight c3, bishop e3. So Fischer goes pawn to c4. One of the reasons that white doesn't typically go for the setup that he does in other Sicilians is because in the e6 Sicilians, black can actually create pressure very quickly against the center and against this knight on c3. So for example, right here, bishop to b4, queen d2, and knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn again. So black is really putting the pressure, and if white continues to defend, black continues to attack the center. And it's a little bit vulnerable, a little bit exposed. So this is why black goes for this. So white instead plays c4, and this structure is called a Mirage C Bind. When you have pawns on e4 and c4 against the Sicilian, this is called the Mirage C Bind. And it arises in a lot of accelerated or hyper-accelerated dragon positions with c5 and g6, but also in the Khan. Now, black plays queen to c7, and white plays knight to c3. So one of the typical ideas is you want to put your bishop on e2, bishop on e3, castle kingside, maybe swing the rook to c1, and play a very normal chess game where you have great control of the center. In the meantime, black wants to try to get some sort of break. So black will try to orchestrate either this d5 break or somehow the b5 break. And oftentimes black gets so desperate in these positions for activity that b5 comes with a pawn sacrifice. Okay, so knight to f6, and Fischer plays bishop to d3. And he leaves in the comments that he misplaces the bishop by playing bishop to d3. So this is supposedly not the best square for it. I guess one of the ideas here is he wanted to defend the e4 pawn. So if black plays bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king, then at least the e-pawn is defended and white can just safely castle. So that must have been Fischer's idea. Black plays knight to c6 in response to this. And Fischer plays bishop to e3, so getting his bishops to these two squares. Okay, bishop to e3, and knight takes on d4, bishop takes d4, and bishop to c5. So both sides are playing pretty normal moves so far. I actually had a pretty similar game to this yesterday on stream from the black side. Black just wants to trade off these two bishops, but trading off the bishops may not be such a great thing for black because all his pawns, or pretty much all his pawns, are on light squares. All the important pawn commitments that he's made are to light squares. So that means that he really needs his dark square bishop to be effective in this position, to cover up all the holes that he's created here. So trading off the dark square bishops doesn't necessarily favor black, which is why after bishop to c5, Fischer plays bishop to c2, saying you can take me if you want, but you'll be left with a huge hole on d6, which will be really hard to cover. Patromat says, hi, what's up, Patromat? Good to have you. So yeah, Fischer goes bishop to c2 and protects the bishop on d4. Now his opponent, Rossetto, goes pawn to d6. Fischer simply castles, and bishop to d7. So I guess black is saying, I want to be flexible with the king. I just want to get out all my pieces first. And this can sometimes backfire, especially if white can create an attack quickly. It's not as possible in this sort of position to just start attacking right away, because black does have defensive resources. For one, black can just trade off the queens, takes, and queen to c5. And I don't even know if this is necessarily the best, but it does help alleviate some of the pressure in the black position, which is why it is a completely viable option. So Fischer can't go for an attack right away with this sort of f4 stuff. Instead of f4, he goes knight to a4. Okay, very interesting move. Now Fischer's saying, if you take my knight, I'll take back, and I have the bishop pair. So you don't want to take, I'll take back with check. And if you don't do anything, I might be starting to control this b6 square. So in some instances, if there is a trade, now not only does white have pressure against this weak d6 pawn, but white's ready to come in knight to b6. So we're trying to force the action somehow with knight to a4. Very, very interesting, instructive move. So bishop takes d4 is played, and queen takes d4. Now rook to d8, just starting to protect the d6 pawn. FY Chess, welcome to the channel. Redeem, make me dab, okay? Not sure if it's in the spirit of this stream, but we'll do it. So rook to d8 and now rook f to d1. A lot of people struggle with this concept of which rook to move to which file, right? Like, let's say you want to go rook d1, but you're not sure, do I move my f rook to d1 or my a rook to d1? And the most important thing to consider is which two files do you want to control. So it's not only about the d file, it's about what other file you want to control. So for example, if you decide that the two files you want to control are the d file and the f file, so somehow you want to get in this this f4, f5 break, so you want to control the d file and the f file, then you want to bring this rook over so that your other rook can keep an eye on the f file. In this position, I'm guessing Fischer decided that he wanted to control the d file and the c file, meaning that he would have to bring this rook to d1 so that this rook can still come to c1. Queen of Andor, what's up? Zaraf says hello. Welcome to you guys. Welcome to the stream. Queen of Andor redeems, make me dab. Okay. So rook f to d1. Castles, and like I was saying, rook a to c1. So these are the two files that white wants to control. Now black goes queen to a5. This is a pretty good move to create counter chances. You can't take this pawn on d6 because I'll do a discovered attack against your queen, and at the end of the line it just doesn't end up working out. I can show that in a second. So white goes queen to b6, because if queen takes d6, black uncovers an attack on the white queen, taking a piece in the process. And if you take, the queen on a5 protects this square as well. So queen takes d8 is just possible here. Alright, so instead, after queen to a5, there was queen to b6, offering a queen trade. And like I was saying, white is eyeing this b6 square for the knight. So the knight wants to sink its teeth into b6. And after the queen trade, which happens, it does so. So knight takes b6 and bishop to c6. Now, Fischer just simply protects the pawn on e4. He goes pawn to f3. And black goes knight to d7, which is given an exclam by Fischer. So What do you guys do in this position? This is a pretty crazy move that Fischer played on this move, but would you consider taking the knight? Would you consider trading off? Or would you try to do something else? Feel free to talk about it in the chat. No suggestion is a bad suggestion, so we're just trying to get our brains working here. This is the first chess I've played today, so we're just trying to get our brains going. What would be your plan in this position? Black has just played knight to d7, and the intent is clear. He wants to trade. He wants to trade off knights. Yeah, so Zaraf says, what else is there to do with the knight? So you do want to trade then, Zaraf. You want to go knight takes on d7. You find that this is common in your games as well. Lacanther says, let's go c5, but it is a bit unsound, I think. So if c5, if pawn to c5, now black could take. And it's tough to find a follow-up. You did say it was a bit unsound. Yeah, so black can just take this pawn. But I like the idea that you want to try to get a pawn on b6. Unfortunately, black doesn't have to go for that. What else do you guys think in this position? What are some of the other possibilities? I think this is a very instructive position, just because the knight comes back to go for a trade, and white clearly has a lot more space than black here. So when you're tight on space, you want to try to trade off. You want to play moves like knight to d7. So black has the right idea. He wants to trade off. But white, having more space, does not want to trade. When you have a spatial advantage, you want to try and retain the pieces. You don't really want to trade off too much. You want to keep the pieces on the board so that you can create more complications for your opponent's cramped pieces, and your pieces have a lot of room to breathe. So that's why in this position, Fischer was determined to keep this knight. Now, if I was truly determined to keep the knight, I would consider some move like knight to a4, but then I'd think, okay, knight a4, I'm keeping the knight, but at what cost? The knight can still jump into c5 and have a good position. Yeah, Zaraf saying, why go knight a4? It seems like you haven't achieved anything. Yeah, so if I really wanted to keep the knights, I would think about knight to a4, but yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't really achieve anything. Black can bring the knight into c5. So as Queen of Andor suggests, great job, Queen of Andor, knight to d5 is the right move in this position. So the idea behind knight to d5 is that if pawn takes on d5, if pawn takes on d5, now we take back with our e-pawn, and this bishop right here is just trapped. So that was a pretty good one. Emperor Hassan says, are you good at chess? I like to think so. So e takes d5 traps the bishop, which is why in this position black simply decides to take bishop takes d5. And after bishop takes d5, white plays e takes d5. It's pretty common in the Sicilian for white to go for this sort of queenside majority, which is one of the factors that explains e takes d5 over c takes d5. White is taking towards the queenside, hoping to someday advance these guys and create an initiative using his passed pawns. So yeah, that's the idea behind e takes on d5. Create an initiative there. Also, when you play e d5, you're opening up your bishop. So this bishop's diagonal is a lot better now. So e takes d5, and black goes e5, which makes a lot of sense here. Because when you're playing with the knight versus the bishop, you really want a close position. So here, black really wants to close down the game. It doesn't make sense for black to go for an open game because the bishop is much better in open positions and the knight is better in closed positions, as it's easier for the knights to jump around and maneuver and do whatever maneuvers they need to get to the right squares. So that's why knights are preferred. Okay, so pawn to e5, closing down the position. And now Fischer doesn't allow the knight into this great outpost. He goes pawn to b4. And this is the idea that I was talking about, where he wants to expand on the queenside. He wants to utilize his queenside pawn majority. The queens are off the board, so it's important for both sides to start considering, how do I start creating pass pawns that can be real threats to the position? Black might start thinking, how can I make a passed E pawn? And white's thinking, how can I make a passed C or D pawn by going like C5 or some move like this? So that's why B4. Now black goes pawn to G6, and white goes bishop to A4, which has two purposes. One, you're attacking the knight, and two, now your rook's file is open, so you can actually go for this C5 move. And because bishop A4 also attacks the knight, black can't go something like rook to C8 to stop C5, because the knight on D7 just hangs. So hence bishop to A4, and black goes B6. Now, because black has pushed both the B and the D pawns to the 6th rank, this C6 square is a huge weakness in his position. He does B6 to stop C5, but at what cost? Because the C6 square now is very, very weak. So pawn to B6, and now white goes rook to D3. Rook D3 is a very interesting move. It has a couple of ideas. One, white might be trying to double up the rooks on the C file, so as to insist on C5 in some position. Maybe rook C3, bishop takes knight, and C5. But the other thing that white might be trying to do is rook to A3 and bishop to C6. And if he can get in both of these moves, then this A6 pawn is dead meat. There's no rook A8 because the bishop on C6 would prevent that. So this might be what white is trying to get in. Rook to A3, bishop to C6. So rook to D3, and now black goes F5. Like I was saying, black wants to try and expand on his side of the board. White has the queen side. The queen side is in white's control. He's got these great pawns here. The bishop on A4. So black has to create something on the king side, particularly with his F and E pawns, trying to support a passed pawn. So okay, F5 is played, and now rook to A3. This idea I was mentioning, targeting the A6 pawn. So after rook to A3, black goes knight to B8, so as to stop bishop to C6. And after knight B8, what would you play here? Try to think about how you'd approach this position. So you set up this rook A3, bishop A4 in the hopes of taking this pawn. But now black is defending the pawn. You're not going to be able to win it. But he does so very, very passively with the knight on B8. So what's our next plan of action? What do we want to do next? Go ahead and suggest some stuff in the chat. Lacanther wants H4, okay. So potentially with the idea of expanding on the king side, H4, H5. So Lacanther has decided that the king side is where he or she wants to play. Okay, any other ideas? Does anybody else have an idea as to where on the board they want to put their pieces? Or what sort of breaks they want to go for? So Lacanther has suggested this sort of idea. Where else would you want to play? Go ahead and leave some suggestions. Feel free to take some time to think about it. In the meantime, I'll answer Emperor Hassan's question. I've been playing for about 9 or 10 years. 3 degrees, welcome. Welcome back to the stream. Do we have any other ideas? Maybe based on something I mentioned before. Queen of Andor wants bishop to D1. Okay, so maneuvering the bishop, maybe bishop D1 with the idea of bishop E2. Try to target the A6 pawn a different way. 3 degrees using his giraffe chess emotes. Love it, love it. So yeah, bishop D1's an interesting idea. You want to go bishop E2. That is something I would definitely consider here. The bishop's not so bad on A4 though. It can be a really useful piece here. It's tying down a lot of black's pieces with this range. So maybe we can keep the bishop on A4. How about pawn breaks? What sort of pawn breaks do you want to go for here? I did mention, just to give you guys a little bit of a hint, I did mention that white wants to play on the queen side. That's the side of the board that white controls, and we have a majority there. So we want to utilize our queen side majority to our advantage. So there's one pawn break in particular that we should be trying to think, can we get this in? Can we get this pawn break in? And it's just a matter of whether or not we can. Race to GM, welcome to the channel. He suggests, I just got here, but I'll send it with C5. Okay. Yeah, C5, I like it. And welcome to SMC Millen 3. Does SMC stand for St. Mary's College, I wonder? Okay, so pawn to C5, you'd send it with C5. Lakanther saying you looked at C5, but you couldn't make it work. So C5 is actually the correct move here. I'll say that much. But the reason it works is after takes. Well, if black takes, we just take back with the rook, right? And our rook is super good. But what happens if black takes here? There's a little tactic. And this is what you have to see in order to make that work. Yeah, exactly. Race to GM. Great. You can never take on D5 because bishop to B3, pinning the rook to the king. That's absolutely correct. Great job to race to GM. So C5 was played by Fischer here. I keep forgetting to promote the main game variation. So C5 played by Fischer. B takes C5 was the choice of black. B takes C5. Fischer, of course, takes back BC5. DC5, Rook C5, and King to G7. So this is the ending. Black wants to activate his king somehow. Maybe the king is coming to F6, maybe coming up the board. Or maybe it's just coming to help out with the defense of this passed d-pawn. King F6, King E7, King D6, something like this. Okay, so after king to G7, white plays rook to B3. Obviously, the A6 pawn is defended by the knight, so our rook might not have as much potential here. And the rook comes to a file with much more potential, the B file. And we're ready to swing into B7 and support our past d-pawn's journey. So rook to B3, now rook F7 played by black. Just with the idea of lateral defense against this rook B7 check. And white plays D6. Very good move. So Fischer comments, the pawn is obviously immune. But for those of you who don't see, the reason that the pawn is immune from capture is because this rook is overloaded. It's defending the knight on B8, and it has to defend against these threats that the d-pawn is making. So if black takes, we can just simply grab his knight down on B8, which is why the pawn is immune. So after pawn to D6, white just has to be very sure that he can defend this pawn. That's the only thing that he has to be careful of. But as of right now, it looks like this knight isn't really going anywhere, so we can get away with such a move. Pawn to D6. Now knight to D7 was played. Just getting the knight out of dodge on B8, maybe trying to remaneuver to F6 or F8 so that black can actually start threatening to take this pawn. So knight D7, and white goes rook to C7, creating this pin. Now it would be problematic for black if white's able to get in this rook to B7, because that would be a really nasty pin, and the knight would actually be lost if we get this rook all the way down to B7. So now black plays knight to F8, yep. And on knight F8, Fischer continues with his idea, rook B to B7. Now, if black takes the pawn, he loses his rook. So he has to do something about the rook. Yeah, race to GM. The annotation is from Fischer's 60 Most Memorable Games. That is the book we are working through right at this moment. So yeah, rook B to B7. Rook takes C7. And Fischer takes with the pawn. Now all of a sudden this d-pawn comes from d5 all the way to c7 in only a matter of moves. So this d-pawn, which is now a c-pawn, is an incredibly valuable asset, and it's going to be tough for black to stop this. So rook to c8. And now Fischer plays this bishop to b3 move, which he gives an exclamation mark. And the reason that this move is so powerful is because here, great job, race to GM. Bishop b3 is right. The way that black wants to equalize here is to take this pawn. So knight e6, rook takes c7 is the idea here that black wants to get in. This will win the pawn and probably hold the game to a draw. So Fischer plays this move, like race to GM says, preventing knight to e6, very important. Now if knight to d7, bishop to e6 is possible with a pin that black actually can't break. So the knight is completely immobilized after bishop b3. Black goes a5, and Fischer just keeps immobilizing his opponent's pieces a4. And this is why this is such a great example of Zugzwang, according to Fischer, because he is completely immobilizing his opponent's pieces. So h6, and look at this. Fischer just plays h3, just cool, calm, collected, just moving his piece to h3, moving his pawn to h3, g5, and g4. Very nice move to hold the pawn structure on the king side, to create a very close pawn structure and forcing black out of his zugzwang. So f takes g4, h takes g4, and here black resigns the game because of the zugzwang. And the reason that this position is zugzwang is because you can't move any of your pieces if you're black. So for example, let's start with the rook. If you move the rook anywhere, now white has rook to b8, and we're forcing the promotion. If black moves the king, just like race to GM said, if black moves the king somewhere, we have rook to b8, and this knight is no longer protected, whereas earlier it was protected by the king. But because of this bishop cutting across the diagonal, there's no king move that keeps an eye on this knight. Very important. So any king move, we go rook to b8, and we take the knight. And on any knight move, let's say knight to g6, our bishop comes into e6 because the knight's not hovering over that square anymore, and we force a promotion. And it's even worse than that if black actually allows us to promote, because we promote with a check. So very, very bad for black. That's why Fischer's opponent resigned here. Yeah, like Kinther's saying, this is beautiful. It is truly a beautiful zugzwang. Very, very unique zugzwang with so many pieces left on the board. Usually the most common zugzwangs happen in like king and pawn endgames. That's where you'll see a lot of these zugzwangs. But right here, g4 takes, and black literally has nothing to do. Sacking the pawns doesn't even help. It actually makes things much worse. So black's still at a loss for moves. Very, very beautiful game. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Here we have Fischer versus Shokran, also from Argentina. I guess this guy had a lot of beautiful games in this Mar del Plata 1959 tournament. Race to GM saying maybe e4 was a try instead of taking on g4. So yeah, instead of taking on g4, e4. But black is still running into these same problems after take on f5, take on f3, and even f6 probably. Just forcing the king away from the defense of the knight. And then you get something like this. So yeah, that's why black couldn't have gone for that. XMGR, what's up, Marius? Saying really aesthetic moves. Yep. Fischer did play some beautiful chess, especially in this Argentina tournament, Mar del Plata 1959. So, okay, here we have Fischer versus Shokran from that same tournament, and this one's a Ruy Lopez. So Fischer plays 1 e4, and he was famous for being able to play these positions really well. So let's see. I admittedly haven't looked at too many Fischer games in my life, aside from what we're doing right now. So this is a really good learning experience for me. Even though I'm not really an e4 player, these ideas are still really helpful because a lot of the ideas that Fischer plays have nothing to do with the opening. So even if you don't play the same openings as Fischer, it's still important to pay attention to the ideas. Bishop to a4, now we get a mainline Ruy Lopez, knight f6, castles. These days, a lot of top grandmasters, if you follow top tournaments, play the Berlin defense, which is knight f6 on move 3. But back in Fischer's day, pretty much everyone was playing this normal Ruy Lopez with a6 and then knight to f6. So now white castles and black plays bishop to e7, simply trying to castle, and black wants to play for d6, b5, knight a5, c5, which maybe we'll see here, depending on what variation black wants to go for. Okay, bishop e7, rook to e1. Now black plays b5, telling this bishop to get off of his back. Bishop b3, and now d6, okay. White goes c3, and I'm kind of breezing past the opening just because it's pretty standard stuff, and we have the most to learn from the very important moves, and so far no important moves have been played. Just theory. So black castles, and now white plays h3, preventing any bishop to g4 stuff after d4. If you go d4 too early, it's possible that black gets to play a move like this, bishop g4. Maybe bishop g4 right here, and you don't really want to allow this pin. So h3. And after h3, black plays knight to a5. So the idea behind knight a5 is you're attacking this bishop right here, and you're trying to play for c5. Black wants this expansion on the queen side. And if you can develop your knight behind the pawn, move the knight back to c6, it'll be a lot happier than with the pawn on c7. So hence knight a5, bishop to c2, and like I was saying, c5. Black goes for this setup. Pawn to d4, and black simply defends everything, queen c7. Now both of these guys are defended. So queen c7 and knight b to d2. Bishop d7, now both sides have almost all of their pieces out. Black has all 4 of their minor pieces out. Maybe this knight on a5 is a little bit misplaced, but at least he's got everything out. And white almost has everything out. Maybe the bishop on c1 is the only burden to the position. So right here, it looks like black is doing just fine, and this is actually a theoretical position. And black is doing fine most games, but the reason that white goes for this setup is because of the space. Despite the fact that black is slightly ahead in development, white has more space. We have pawns on e4 and d4, as opposed to this pawn structure with slightly less space. And that's the claim that white makes to his advantage. So bishop to d7, and now knight to f1. This is a very common maneuver in a lot of closed e4 setups. Not only in the Ruy Lopez, but also in the Italian game. You'll see this knight swinging around and then trying to come to the king side. Sometimes this idea is accompanied by g4. So g4, knight g3, knight f5. Something like this, or knife f5, because it's such a powerful move. So knight f1, now rook f to e8, and Fischer goes knight e3, which is actually a slight improvement on what I was saying, knight g3, because you're also looking at the d5 square. So not only are you eyeing f5, but you're also eyeing d5, which could be a valuable outpost in the future. If we can ever trade off this knight, or if the knight moves, then d5 will be a very good outpost for us. So knight to e3 is played, and now g6. So black is fearful of the potential of these knights. Maybe he was worried white would play knight h4, knight f5, just really bury a knight into the black position. So he plays pawn to g6. And now Fischer plays d takes on e5. So opening up the file for his queen, getting ready to control this d5 square with his knight. D takes e5, d takes e5, and okay. So now Fischer plays knight to h2. This knight on e3 is already ideally placed, but if we think about which of our pieces can be improved, it's not only this bishop on c1 that could be better. In fact, it's unclear if the bishop even has to move from c1, because it already controls all of these squares from its home of c1. So it's unclear if we even have to move the bishop. But this knight on f3 does not have that many good squares. This is a common trap that chess players fall into. They'll develop a piece to the most natural square, and then they'll leave it there for as long as they can because they think, oh, this piece is developed. That means that I don't have to do anything more with it. I brought it out on move 2, so it should be good there. It's in the center. It controls central squares. But in reality, this knight doesn't have anywhere to go. The e5 pawn is sufficiently defended by the queen. So the queen on c7 defends e5. And d4, obviously, we cannot go there. G5 and H5 are attempts at rerouting, but at this moment, neither is particularly effective. G5 doesn't really make a threat. These guys are defended. And knight H4 no longer useful because we can't control F5. There's a pawn that protects that square. So for this reason, white tries to remaneuver the knight to H2, possibly coming out to G4, trying to trade off for this guy. Remember, I mentioned that if this knight ever gets traded, then we can bring our knight into D5. So this could be white's idea. Knight to G4. All right, so Fischer goes knight H2, rook A to D8, lining up against the queen. So now if knight to G4, Fischer's opponent can take with the bishop, not only unleashing an attack with the rook, but also with the bishop. And this is just winning for black. So instead, Fischer goes queen to F3. And this is a very reasonable move. This move seems very reasonable to me because the queen on D1, it was guarding the D file, putting some pressure, but now black controls the D file. So we want to go to the side of the board we want to play on. And this is a theme that I'm starting to pick up on in Fischer's games. Remember in the last game, he noted that he wanted to play on the queen side. So because he wanted to play on the queen side of the board, he played all these moves like here, and he started pushing all his pawns going for c5. In this position, Fischer has noted that he really wants to go for the king side attack. So he's putting all his pieces on the king side, and that's what's important here. So queen to f3, bishop to e6, and now Fischer wants to make some other moves on the king side. So let's see how he continues. Indeed, he goes knight h to g4. This move that I was mentioning, just getting the knight in, starting an attack on the king side. Knight takes g4, and which way would you guys take back? Would you take knight takes or h takes? Go ahead and give me a comment in the chat based on what you would want to do in this position. I see Vinny has used the onesie command. Yep. So if we get 7 more subscribers, if we get to 40 subs, then I will buy the onesie. That is my commitment to you all. I will buy the onesie and I will wear it on stream. So we're trying to get to 40 subs. Hopefully we can do it on this stream. And then I'll invest in that beautiful onesie. In the meantime, go ahead and let me know. What you would do here, which piece you'd want to take back with, and why. I'll let you guys give it some thought. Race to GM says, I'd probably play h takes g4 to play g3, king g2, and rook to h1. Okay, race to GM. That's a good suggestion. Thanks for suggesting. Lacanther says, I wonder if it's possible to play h takes g4 and then play some knight to f5 idea. Okay, so all of you guys seem to be leaning towards h takes g4 because it offers the most kingside attacking potential. And I totally agree. Hg4 offers the most potential. And just looking ahead a couple moves, I think it's actually really instructive how Fischer continues this attack. So g3, king g2, rook h1, as race to GM suggested, seems very reasonable to me. That's something I definitely consider going for here. And Lacanther's knight to f5, given the right circumstances, could work as well. It seems like a very dynamic move, so I wouldn't count it out at all. Knight to f5 could be a very important idea. Here, black goes queen to c6, possibly keeping an eye on on this queen if the e-pawn ever moves. But yeah, queen c6 also just getting onto a better rank. This is a bit of a hard move to explain, queen to c6, but I guess the e-pawn no longer needs to be defended, so black felt the need to come up. And Fischer goes g5 here. And this is a very, very interesting, instructive idea. I'll use all my buzzwords there, interesting and instructive. So pawn to g5, and if he can get away with this, then he's going to have a real hold on black's position. Because the pawn on g5 is very well placed to protect these two squares, and we can try to sink a piece into either f6 or h6. So pawn to g5, and here yeah, wait, hold on, I just missed a move. Pawn to g5, and where's the black move? Oh, knight to c4. Okay, so black tries to trade off the knights. This is his idea, knight to c4. Like I said, when you have less space, when you're being attacked, you want to try and get some piece trades in. Because the more pieces you trade, the faster you'll get to an endgame where you'll be safe. So now Fischer plays knight to g4. He says, no knight trade for you. I'm going to try and sink my teeth into one of these squares here, f6 or h6. And, okay, so knight to g4. Bishop takes on g4. Queen takes g4. And now the knight comes back to b6, possibly trying to remaneuver over to the king side. Maybe knight d7, knight f8, knight to e6. Let's see if Fischer gives a line here, or if we can figure out what was supposed to happen if bishop takes on g5. So Fischer says bishop takes g5 puts white's concept to the crucial test after knight to d5, okay? So knight d5 is a discovered attack against this bishop. And if he takes, so knight to d5 and bishop takes on c1. Now knight f6 check. King goes to h8. And rook a takes c1. And I guess here Fischer just claims that even though he's down a pawn, this knight on f6 is compensation enough in the position. Okay, let's see what more he gives here. Rook f8, queen to g3, preparing queen h4. Threatening mate. Queen to c7, queen g5. Okay, still threatening to come in. King to g7. And now white can force a draw with knight to h5, or try for more with either f4 or rook to e3. So Fischer just intended this to be a full pawn sacrifice. Race to GM says, I don't see why black can't take g5. Like, what good discovery is there? Hopefully this explanation clears that up, that white can either force a draw or play for more with rook e3, swing the rook over to g3, or go for f4 like Fischer says. Okay, I'm glad that makes perfect sense. Awesome. Yeah, I was wondering that as well. So the main line is this. This is what Fischer's opponent went for. And takes, knight to b6 with this possible idea of rerouting, like I mentioned. And then Fischer goes pawn to g3. So now he's doing the idea that Race to GM suggested earlier. You want to go king g2, rook h1, and pile up pressure on the opponent king side. So g3, black goes c4, trying to open up lines for his own pieces. King to g2, knight d7. Maybe he wants to do this, like I was saying. Rook to h1, and indeed knight to f8. And knight to f8 is a dual purpose move. I talk about these moves a lot on stream if you've been here before. Moves that have two purposes, obviously. One is to protect this, and the other is to jump into the really good e6 square and start attacking against this g5 pawn. So knight f8, and now white plays pawn to b4. So I think this is part of the genius of Fischer, honestly, that a lot of us here would be solely focused on the king side. But what Fischer does is he divides his attention between the queenside and kingside, making sure to shut down his opponent's threats, in addition to reacting on the side of the board that he wants to play on. So I think it'd be very easy for a lot of players, including myself, to just have a single focus, single track mind, and go like rook to h6, queen h4, try to bring the other rook to h1, and just try to attack. But what Fischer does is totally different. He goes pawn to b4, and he's saying, okay, if you take me en passant, I will have a really open position for my bishops. I'm guessing he takes back with the bishop. And now it's just a straight pawn sacrifice, but his bishop is really good on this diagonal. And if you don't do anything about this b pawn, if you go queen e6, which is what was played in the game, then my pawn on b4 shuts down your queenside counterplay. So earlier you had all this play with b4, but now by playing b4 myself, I'm shutting it down. And anytime you go a5, I play the solid a3, and I keep things shut down. So there's no en passant anymore after queen e6. And white plays queen all the way back to e2. Very patient move. Just coming back to e2, saying, I don't need my queen all the way on the king side. I can move it to the center of the board and make some commitments with it later. So queen to e2 played, and now a5. Okay, so what I was imagining here and what I would probably do is a3. And I mentioned last time we were looking at Fischer games that my favorite moments in these games are when I want to do something and Fischer does something completely different. That's my favorite because it shows a gap in my understanding. And race to GM wants a4. Not quite. It's an interesting idea, but I think black will just be able to get away with taking, and maybe he gets a really strong pass pawn. b3, something like this. So, yeah, this is where my thinking diverges from Fischer's. I would think, okay, just close up the queen side, go for my attack. But Fischer actually goes b takes a5. A move that I wouldn't really consider because now our queenside blockade doesn't exist. We're allowing our opponent play on the side of the board that he wants to play on. So queen a6, trying to scoop this pawn back up. And bishop to e3. Okay, so developing the last piece into the game makes perfect sense. Queen takes a5, and now a4. So, yeah, Fischer, I guess, is trying to liquidate the entire queen side. After a4, black plays rook to a8. But before we get into that, I'll just clarify that I think Fischer really wants to trade off all the queenside pawns through something like this. Actually, here he'd probably take with the bishop, attack the rook, which is kind of trapped in on e8. But basically, no matter what black does, Fischer is achieving some sort of liquidation here, trading off some of the strong pawns on the queen side. So he can take this one, and now he has a passed a pawn. So this all looks pretty good. It's interesting how he just shifted the focus to the completely other side of the board. He just shifted the focus entirely. Okay, rook to a8, and a takes b5 was played. And Fischer's saying, okay, if you go for the two rooks, then I'm going to get these two really strong pawns on b5 and c3. So I'll show that position in a second. Black actually ends up taking back. But if queen takes a1, going for the two rooks, which oftentimes is a good idea, just not in this position, white scoops up this pawn at the end of the line. We have two bishops, and we have these passed b and c pawns. So this is why white was okay with this variation. Alright, so queen takes b5 was the choice of Fischer's opponent. And now rook h to b1. So completely shifting the focus. This is super instructive. I know I say that word a lot when I talk about Fischer games, but this idea is very instructive. He was attacking on the king side, and then the shift focus, or the focus shifted all the way to the queen side, the completely other side of the board, completely different side of the board. So, all right, rook to b1 played, and now after rook to b1, Fischer's opponent plays queen to c6, keeping an eye on e4, although it is currently protected. So queen c6, now rook to b6, and he keeps attacking the queen. And he keeps making this point that anytime you go for the 2 rooks for the queen, I will take your pawn and just be better, because I have the 2 bishops and I have a pass pawn. So very interesting play here by Fischer. Rook to b6, and now queen to c7 by Fischer's opponent. Rook b to a6. So he's okay with a rook trade, but he wants to do it on his own terms by controlling the a file. Rook takes, and rook to c8, okay? Overprotecting the c4 pawn, that makes sense. Queen to g4 now, keeping an eye on the rook on c8, keeping that rook honest. So queen to g4 is played, and knight to e6, cutting off the connection between the queen and the rook, but possibly opening the door for sacrifices. I would not be surprised if rook to e6 was a try here. That's something I definitely consider. Rook to e6. So before we flip the page and see what Fischer did, let's try to think about it a little bit. Is it possible to sack the exchange? Takes. The king moves. And is this something that we would go for? Maybe pawn to f4, start attacking like this. That does allow queen d6, simplifying, trading off the queens. So, okay. Oh, but then the rook on c8 is hanging. So this could be a viable variation. Takes. King to g7 and f4. That seems like something that's very playable. So let's see what Fischer ends up doing in the game. Let's flip the page. Okay. Instead, he goes bishop to a4 here, and he doesn't give a line for the exchange sacrifice, but basically what I was saying was maybe do this. Sack the exchange and play this f4 move. And there are a couple of threats. So first of all, black can go wrong pretty easily. Queen d6, you take this. Queen c6, you take the bishop. So lots of things hanging. And if you don't do anything, if you just play a normal move, then I'm going to go f5, f6. So that's what I was thinking in this position, with the idea of bishop d4 also. So takes bishop d4 maybe. And yeah, black is getting into some trouble on these diagonals. So instead, Fischer goes bishop to a4 here. Possibly with the idea of rook to c6, just trading off even more. And the bishop is good on a4. So bishop a4 is played, and here black goes rook to b8, rook to c6, and queen to d8. So black is insisting on keeping this rook so as to generate some counterplay maybe. Rook to b2, fighting for counterplay. So queen d8, and here Fischer goes for the idea that I was mentioning, but it's way more powerful here than it was when I suggested it. Rook takes e6, and the reason it's way more powerful is because this pawn is also hanging. So rook takes e6, if this happens, then black's just losing. So black finds a really cool defensive resource here. Queen to c8. Welcome to Jamie CJ58. Thanks for joining the channel. Okay, queen c8 now sets up this pin. So now the rook is immobilized. And yeah, Jamie says, hey, you came by Jonathan's stream last night. We were all talking about giraffes after that. That's funny. That's funny. Yeah, giraffes are our spirit animal. If you want to use the command onesie, then you can check out a giraffe onesie that we're trying to get. Hence the 7 more subs and I buy the onesie. Giraffes are a great animal. Yep. Giraffes are a great animal. We also have some giraffe emotes. But in the meantime, while I talk about giraffes, I want you guys to look for the game-ending tactic in this position. There's a tactic here that just finishes the game. UMOP, using those emotes. Love it. Yeah, the onesie looks great. We just need 7 more subs before we get it. Lakinther says bishop to d7. I think that might be what... yeah, I think that might have been what UMOP meant. Yeah, D7. Okay, nice. Great tactical vision, guys. So for those of you who didn't quite see the idea, you want to be able to go like rook takes G6 and win the queen. So you go bishop D7, bring this queen to a square where it's not defended by the rook. So bishop D7 takes, and now rook G6, and we take the queen for free. So great tactical vision to all you guys. Great job on this one. And it's time to move on to the next game. Bishop D7 was the game-ending tactic. Let me just promote that variation. Yeah, takes. Okay, it was... Yeah, bishop A4, okay. And this, okay. Now time to move forward to the next game. Let me take a little bit of a water break here. But yeah, we're going to start on the next one. And the next one is Olufsen versus Fischer. It's a King's Indian, and we're going to look at it from the black perspective. So I believe all you subscribers don't have ads right now. I believe I enabled like subscribers don't have to watch ads. So let me know in this short break how you guys are doing. If you like this type of stream. Jamie CJ says you dropped a sub on YouTube. Appreciate that. Yep. Thanks for showing love to the YouTube channel. YouTube subs are completely free. So if you want to subscribe on YouTube, then that is completely free. The subscribers for the onesie, that's specifically for Twitch subscribers. So YouTube subscribers are very welcome, and it's free to do. You can check out the YouTube channel. I'll put it in here. Go ahead and check it out if you're interested. I upload educational content there as well. But yeah, let's jump into this next game. It's 7 more Twitch subscribers for the onesie. All right, let's get into it. I always sort of lose my voice a little bit after these game analysis streams, but I think this could kind of be my thing. Just like doing a bunch of game analysis training. I feel like that wouldn't be such a bad thing to do. There's no blame command here. It feels weird. Jonathan's chat is people doing blame and talking about the Knockmaster Gambit. So what's the blame command like? Like what would I make the blame command? Yeah, I'd have to check that out. Okay, maybe I'd have to use some variables. I'm not that technologically advanced, but I'll do my best. I did try to do some technology stuff with the emotes, using technology to advance the channel, so hopefully that turned out okay. Pawn to c4, let's jump right in. This is Olufsen versus Fischer from Zurich, 1959. And this is a King's Indian defense. So white plays pawn to c4, the English, knight to f6, and Fischer enters his favorite King's Indian defense. d4, bishop to g7, e4, pawn to d6. And now this is just a normal King's Indian. It's transposed from an English to mainline d4. So Jamie CJ says when Jonathan... Oh, okay. So Jonathan made you a mod, Jamie, and you made a few commands. Okay, yeah, I'm happy to make you a mod. So I just do mod Jamie, right? Jamie CJ. Jamie CJ 58. hopefully you oh wait. So do you think you'd be able to, or I don't know how easy it is to make commands. I don't know if, yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Jamie. So I just do mod Jamie CJ58. Okay, so I granted moderator privileges to you, Jamie, even though you're super new to the channel, the most recent follower. I trust you. I'm a pretty trusting guy. I don't think you're gonna take advantage of my trust. So thank you for offering to help out. Really appreciate that. And I could use someone as tech savvy as you. I'm a 70-year-old man at heart, both when it comes to the type of chess I play and yeah. What is the type of chess I play or my interaction with technology? No pressure, Jamie. Yes, no pressure. Okay, yeah, just whatever commands you think would be helpful. I do have Nightbot, so just whatever you think would be helpful. So I'll leave that in your hands. I trust you. Let's get into the chess. That's my specialty. So knight to f3 is played. This is just mainline King's Indian theory. Castles, bishop to e2, and e5. Now, in some of these streams, we're going to be looking at the games of Tigran Petrosian. 3 Degrees says Jamie CJ just timed you out. Really? Yeah, Jamie is the first mod on the channel. I don't really know if if mods have like other duties, but I don't know if a mod is something that someone wants to be. But yeah, okay. Basically, the blame thing is a big meme on his channel. Everyone spams it on the chat. So I was joking, saying that it's nice not to be blamed for a change. What commands do you need? So, yeah, just go ahead and let me know what... yeah, so if... just let me know what types of commands are, like, popular, because I actually don't know. I don't know what sort of stuff other streamers do with their commands. So whatever you think, if I think of something specific, I'll let you know. But just use your discretion for now. What I was saying about this position is that the most common variation, the most common variation is castles, knight to c6 and d5. So white waits to play d5 until the knight comes here, and black just gets this attack with knight to d7 and f5. Yeah, I do have a Lichess or chess.com. For Lichess, it's giraffe_chess. So that'd be great if we could do a challenge command. Love your innovative thinking already. Giraffe_chess, and it's the same on chess.com. So what I was saying is, in future streams, we are going to look at the games of the great Tigran Petrosian. And I have a feeling that Tigran has potential to become my favorite grandmaster. He's a very, very strong positional player. That's really my style. I love positional chess. And so we're going to look at his games. This is actually called the Petrosian Variation because of how good Tigran was at playing this. So pawn to d5 is really a squeeze line. You're trying to put as much pressure on your opponent as possible. Here we're probably going to see Fischer dismantle it, but hopefully we'll see some good variations, some good games in this variation when we look at Python strategy by Tigran Petrosian. Okay, so bishop. So this is played, and now Fischer plays knight b to d7, the most popular move in this position. Patromat gifted a tier 1 sub to Jamie CJ 58. Thanks so much to Patromat. Really appreciate it. And 5 emotes shared. Wonderful, wonderful. Much love to Patromat. Thank you for supporting the channel. Every sub goes a long way. And before we go back to this game, we are going to make a little update. There we go. It's now down to 6. Let's do it. Let's keep this going. I love the energy. So knight b to d7 is the most popular move in this position, and here we go bishop to g5. Jamie CJ says commands and okay. So he's adding it to Nightbot. Wonderful. Yeah, Patromat, you're a real G. Thanks, man. Patromat's a real G. Okay. So bishop to g5 is the most popular move. H6, and here there are actually a couple of moves. So right here, there's bishop to h4 and bishop to e3. Now, bishop to h4 is the most popular, and it's what was played in the game. But I'll just point out that bishop to e3 is also a variation, and it's actually quite tricky. There are a lot of details here that I don't want to bore you guys with or get into, because it's very specific d4 theory. But bishop h4 is the most popular move, retaining the pin on the knight. And now Fischer plays pawn to a6. Okay. So usually in the King's Indian, you see a5 and knight to c5. But here Fischer goes for a different idea, a6, presumably with the idea of going to b5. Scratch and Magician says, who's Fischer's opponent? Here he is playing against Olufsen of Iceland. Or maybe the game was played in Iceland. Yeah, Jamie, I think that is a new record. That is definitely a new record. So a6 and now knight to d2. And one of the points of this variation is you want to try and bring your bishop back to f2. So f3, bishop f2 is a very common idea here. This is something that White's looking to play so as to support his c5 break. Every piece is going to flock over to the queen side and support c5. That's one of the ideas here. So knight d2 and queen to e8 by Fischer, getting out of the pin. And once you unpin, now you can move the knight and play for f5, the classic King's Indian break. So queen e8 and now g4 by Olufsen. And this is given a exclam and a question mark because it's very, very double-edged. You're not going to be able to castle kingside now. That's one of the points. Yeah, Scratch the Magician saying g4 seems questionable. It's actually a very standard move in certain King's Indian positions because you're stopping f5. So that's the whole point, that we're stopping our opponent from playing f5 if we play g4. And although we're not going to get to castle, oftentimes White actually leaves the king in the center of the board. By the way, welcome to King Tian, who just joined. So g4 is thematic. But Fischer goes knight to h7, and he's saying, okay, you played g4, but I might try to do this anyways. I might try to go f5 anyways, and hope that I can get to your king before you can get to mine. So knight h7, queen to c2, and knight g5, okay. Now, knight g5 isn't the first move that would come to my mind. I mean, if takes, then h takes is very good for black. We control f4 and h4, and we have the bishop pair. So we're not worried about that, but it's just that the knight on g5, it's unclear where it wants to go from there. But I guess Fischer's idea might be knight to h3, knight f4. So if we can get the knight to f4, it's really good. So this might be his idea, knight to h3, knight to f4. So in response to knight to g5, Fischer's opponent plays h3. Okay, so stopping that idea, he wanted to play knight to h3. Yeah, Scratch and a Magician says knight h3 is not a move that will quickly occur to you. Okay, so a little piece of advice. Before thinking about specific moves, I don't know what rating level you're at, Scratchin', but when you're thinking about plans and you're thinking about moves that you want to do, first think about your end goal and work back from there. I believe that's called deductive reasoning, if I'm not getting confused. So yeah, start with your goal and then think about how you can achieve it. So if your goal is to get a knight to f4, then, I mean, if you're just thinking about moves first, knight to h3 isn't what would come to my mind. But yeah, if you have this knight f4 move in mind, then it becomes a little bit easier to see what the plan is. So h3 stops that. Good move by Olufsen. And knight to c5 by Fischer. Okay, I was mentioning that this is a pretty common square for the knight. What's his idea if just b4? So white castled queenside, but I'm thinking as white I'd consider this. So because I'd consider it, let's just think about it for a second. So I guess two things occur to me here after knight to c5. One is that if you go b4, then basically you're making a claim that you want to play on the queen side and you don't really want to castle here. Because after b4, it is unsafe to commit your king to the queen side. You have weakened those squares, so you don't really want to weaken even more with b4 if you plan on placing your king here. And the other thing is, I'm considering the possibility of this, although I'm not sure if it is possible. So yeah, it's a piece sacrifice. It's a full piece sack. I don't think it works though. So we sack a piece. And then we go f5, takes, and I was thinking we just keep rolling forward, e4, f4, bring the queen into e5, but this probably just doesn't work. Like rook c1 maybe. Do we sack another pawn, f4? Maybe, and then f3. This is getting quite complex, but I think at the end of the day, our opponent just steps out of dodge, and we don't have much of an attack anymore. Sorry for that random tangent, but that's one thing I was considering. So b4, I'm guessing black just wants to go back and say now you can't really castle comfortably. Otherwise, I'll start blowing things up on the king side, pawn to b5, something like this, and just start attacking. So, okay. Knight to c5 castles queenside, and now black plays bishop d7. And this has two purposes. One, we're supporting knight a4, and two, we're supporting b5. So bishop d7, really good multi-purpose move, dual-purpose move. Okay. Now f3. Possibly with the idea of returning to f2 and going for h4, trying to take advantage of the misplaced knight on g5. Umop saying e4 is very defended. I prefer b4 because I don't have to castle, and I'd prefer switching to a tactics game opposed to the position boredoms. Yeah, so I guess one of White's ideas is to play on the king side. So he doesn't mind the queen side being closed as long as he can start pushing on the king side and creating an attack here. Yeah. So, all right. And Scratchin' Magician says, what about rook d to f1, trying to support f4 in one go? So one thing that's important here is that right now the dark square bishop is not... Oh, shit. Sorry, I just keep pushing the mic off the table. My bad. So one important detail here is that this bishop on g7 isn't that good. But if you get this f4 moves in, then black can take, and suddenly this bishop becomes good. Yeah, you see it comes alive. Okay, good. So f3, now knight to a4. This is one of the ideas that I was talking about, just trying to trade off this good defensive piece. Then maybe it'll be easier for us to start an attack. Knight to a4, and knight takes on a4. Bishop takes on a4, and b3. Okay, so trying to solidify, but also creating weaknesses on the dark squares. Let's see how Fischer takes advantage of this. Bishop comes back to d7. Bishop to f2, and now when I think about how I would proceed here, the first move that comes to my mind is pawn to b5. And then maybe I start considering a5, a4. But Fischer plays c5 here, which is along those lines as well. So same sort of idea, trying to create something on the king side, on the queen side. But yeah, the other thing is it prepares to go for b5. So closing down the queen side before attacking there seems very reasonable. Thanks to Jamie for adding those commands. It looked like the sub goal command says that we're at 35 subscribers, which it looks like we're at 34. So I'm not sure if that's like a mistake from Nightbot, if it's like automated. Yeah, c5 allows b5 without white being able to play c5 themselves. Yeah, very good point. So yeah, Jamie raises a great point that if we go b5 right away, white can go c5 themselves, which is why c5 on our part is such a good move. So great point by Jamie there. c5, and now white plays h4, continuing with his idea of attacking the king side, and knight to h7. Now, one thing that's important to note here is that probably if white tries to attack, black will just close things down. He's just going to go pawn to g5, and suddenly things are very closed. Yeah, so this is problematic for white because he no longer has an attack. This f4 square is very weak. Fonza, what's up? Good to see you. So yeah, he doesn't want to do that. Instead, after h4, he goes bishop to e3, putting pressure against the h6 point. All right, so bishop e3 and b5. White continues with, black continues over here. Okay, got it. That makes sense. It probably counts me as a subscriber. Thanks, Jamie. Okay. So pawn to b5 is the idea here. Knight to b1, and let's see how Fischer continues this attack. Pawn to f5. Okay. So we're seeing this theme in pretty much every single game, right? We're seeing the same theme recur, that Fischer is concentrating on one side of the board, then all of a sudden he switches to the other side. So this man is playing on both sides of the board, which is something that attack 101, your like first coach will tell you not to do. If you're doing a queenside attack, focus all your efforts on the queen side. And Fischer's out here proving that wrong, trying to play on both sides of the board. So this is very, very instructive. Fischer chooses to play on both the king side and the queen side, acknowledging that his pieces are so long range that, okay, first let's see what white plays. White plays g takes. So after all of this stuff, his pieces are so long range that pieces on the king side can support the queen side attack. So these two bishops can both support whatever black is trying to do on the queen side. Yeah, so interesting idea by Fischer, playing on both sides of the board. Bishop takes now queen to d2. And yeah, I'm not surprised to see this e4 move, opening up this bishop, and this bishop is already so good. So yeah, looks like a go game. Yep. Yeah, so UMOP wants to keep the g-pawn, but I think that might be too much of a too high a cost, you know, giving up the rook. Giving up the rook for this, it might be too much. We might be giving up too much here. It also allows the possibility, whenever you give up so much material like a rook, you're allowing your opponent the possibility of giving back a piece to defend and still be winning. So that's one thing to consider, that g takes is better for that reason. We're not giving up any material, and we have a really strong attack. But keep the suggestions going. I like it. Rook to g1, trying to pile up over here. Bishop takes h6 is now a serious threat as well. So rook d to g1, now e takes f3, opening up the diagonal for this beautiful bishop here. And bishop takes on h6. Okay. Now, Fischer uses the power of his rooks, the really also long-range pieces, to defend the bishop. So the rook comes to a7. Always remember that if you've pushed your pawns, then you can even use this rook as a defensive piece. It's a theme in a couple of different openings. So make sure to keep this idea in mind. Rook a7, bishop takes g7, takes, mass exchanges happen, takes, and bishop to d3 at the end of the line. And what white's trying to do here, actually, I don't really mind this position for white so much. I think if black makes a small error, then the game could just be over very quickly, because this king is wide open. So white is trying to trade down the main defender of the king. Scratch and Magician saying that endgames won't favor black. Yeah, right now it's a little bit unclear. So it's about equal material, and black has this pass pawn on f3. So if he gets... okay. Is going to favor black. I misread that. Yeah, endgame should favor black because of this pass pawn. Yep, that's right. So after bishop to d3, black plays b takes c4, another intermediate move. We talked about that last time. Rook to g1 check. So an intermediate move followed by an intermediate move. King h8. And queen to c3 check. So white really trying to mate black here with the rook and the queen both coming in. But there's a reason that this game is in Fischer's most memorable games book. He wants to trade off the queens, queen to e5. And this follows the point that Scratch and Magician was making earlier, that essentially any endgame will be better for black because of this pass pawn. So after this exchange, which does happen, and this exchange, black has these two connected pass pawns that can march up the board quite quickly. And although the material is even, it's rook, knight, and 4 pawns versus rook, knight, and 4 pawns. Like Scratch and Magician said, the endgame favors black because we can get these pawns rolling quite quickly. So this game ended shortly after this. Let's follow the game to the end. Knight to f6, just bringing the last piece into the game. Knight to d2 and f2, advancing the pass pawn. Rook h1 and e4. Okay. White tries to defend against these strong threats. King d1, trying to bring the king over. Set up some sort of blockade with the king, knight, and rook. Okay, e3. Knight to f1. Rook to e5. King e2, okay. And now knight h5, very powerful move. So the idea is if white liquidates by taking this pawn, he falls into this fork between the king and the rook. And even if not, we're threatening knight to f4 check, which forces the king out of the way and allows us to advance our pawn and promote it. So after knight to h5, king to f3, and e2, white resigns, left with no other option. Knight to e3 runs into this. Or actually, that's not even the best move. We could just promote. Yeah, any move runs into this promotion. So it's just game over. Shake hands and good game. So yeah. Oh, let's promote this variation real quick. All right. So that was a good game. And I think we should get in one more game before I play some subscribers. I think that would be good. 4 games takes about 2 hours. We're spending about 30 minutes per game. So we're doing a really good in-depth analysis. Hope you guys are enjoying it so far. Just so I don't completely lose my voice, I'll take some more water. But next is Fischer versus Kerry's. Zurich 1959. So this will be an exciting one. And he calls it Meat and Potatoes. What an odd title. Don't know why he did that. Looks like we're going to get another Rui Lopez. Shoe Factory says, just woke up. Hi, Dave. What's up, Shoe Factory? How are you doing? All right, we are going to create a new chapter for this one. We're on game 8. So starting position, Fischer is playing as white. Scratchin Magician says, is this 60 memorable games? Indeed it is. We are taking a look at Bobby Fischer's My 60 Most Memorable Games. Hopefully you guys can see that. Yep. So we're making our way through that. We're going in order just because all of these games are very good. So we're just going to go in order. And we're also going to be taking a look, if you're just joining, we're also going to be taking a look at Petrosian's Python strategy, but not on this stream, in a future stream. Yeah, half awake, perfect Roy Lopez game. Yeah, that's going to be good. A good way to wake up. Good way to start your day. What's my rating, by the way? I'm about 2200, like 2203. Okay. Hopefully we've got enough subscribers on this stream to play some fun subscriber games. But first we're going to finish this. Let me change the orientation to white, actually. Okay. Save chapter. Okay. Looks good now. So this is Fischer versus Kerry's Zurich 1959. And he goes e4. All right. Black goes pawn to e5, and like I said, we see another Roy Lopez with bishop to b5 and a6, bishop a4. The same standard stuff that we saw in the last one. Castles, bishop to e7. So I'm going to jump past the opening. We've seen this all before. b5, bishop to b3, castles kingside, c3, d6. This should all look pretty familiar. h3, knight a5, bishop c2, c5. Same exact game so far. Down to this move right here, knight to d2. And I don't believe our opponent played... Actually, maybe it was c4. I don't think that the last game was c takes d4. So this is already a slight difference. Race to GM saying bishop d7 last game. Yep, that's right. Good memory, good memory. So now c takes d4 is what Kerry tries. C takes d4, and the bishop finds a home on b7, hoping that one day the e4 pawn will be a weakness that black can attack. So bishop to b7, and now knight to f1. Same idea by Fischer, trying to swing the knight over to a more useful square, especially now that the bishop doesn't protect f5. So we're trying to come in. By the way, shout out to RG Brito. Welcome to the channel. Okay, so knight to f1. The a rook comes to c8. Now we have to be a little bit careful. Our bishop is on pre. So the bishop comes to d3. Sometimes I'll kind of autopilot a move like bishop to b1 just because it's very safe there. But those are, of course, in d4 positions, which I get much more often. I think bishop to d3 is perfectly fine here. So Fischer brings it to a more active square. Knight to c6. Now the knight is coming back to attack the center and potentially also threaten knight to b4. But Fischer ignores all of this. He says, I'm just going to go knight to e3. Your bishop no longer attacks my e4 pawn. So instead of two attackers, you only have one attacker, meaning I have some flexibility for knight to e3. Rook f to e8 is played, and now knight to f5, which seems like a very natural move. I'd probably play knight f5 here. Fischer gives it a question mark though, and he says this is a superficial plan. Meaning that he can go here, but after bishop to f8, he's not really threatening anything immediately. So it's a good square, but it can be kicked by the g pawn at some point in the future, and we're not creating concrete enough threats. If black plays e takes d4 instead of that, Okay, so e takes d4 instead of rook to f8. All right, so knight to f5 here looks strong. Attacking both of these. Raid incoming. Okay, from who? Who is raiding? XKD2, thank you for the raid. Appreciate that, man. Yeah, I look forward to checking out your channel. XKD2, welcome to the stream, and thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate you. So yeah, if King D2, love those emotes. Okay. He says, "Hey, what's up? What's up?" So yeah, knight to f5 here attacks the bishop and attacks the pawn. And if you take e d4, then your d pawn is going to be permanently weak. Hopefully that answers a question for you. Tiny Pizza just followed. Welcome to the channel, Tiny Pizza. All right. So hopefully that answers your question about e d4. So rook e8, knight to f5, bishop f8. This all happened. And now Fischer notices that the knight on f6 is looking a little bit weak. So he wants to attack it somehow. The bishop no longer defends the knight. So he goes bishop to g5. And this is another one of those dual purpose moves that I love talking about. So one purpose is we'd love it if we could just grab this knight. We'd love it if we could just grab this knight and cement the knight on the f5 square. So if we could do this, then our knight is going to be unmovable. It's going to be great. So the other purpose is rook to c1, and we control the c file. So another one of those dual purpose moves, bishop g5, knight to d7, avoiding the capture. You know, black doesn't want this knight on f5 to be cemented in the position. So he goes knight to d7. Okay, that's very reasonable. And now rook to c1. So one thing I like about rook c1 is, first of all, we're getting this pin going. And second of all, we can play bishop to b1 with a clear conscience, because nothing is really being attacked. Nothing is really being attacked in our position. d4 is protected. And our rook will not be stuck on a1 after bishop to b1, as we've already developed it to c1. All right, so after rook to c1, queen to b8, stepping out of the pin, and bishop to b1. Yeah, so that's what I was kind of talking about there, that we can play this move with a clear conscience. Our d4 pawn is extra defended now. The queen also defends, and we might reroute our bishop. That's not completely out of the realm of possibility. So a3, bishop a2 could be an idea. Because if we think about this position, this bishop is kind of hitting a wall, right? The bishop on b1 doesn't really do anything with the pawn on e4. So we can think about rerouting it a3, bishop to a2, where it's super strong on this diagonal. And we might even get to play some sort of sack on f7. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that. Okay. Chesspatzer US, what's up? I thought you were already following the channel. But welcome. Thanks for following. Okay. Bishop to b1. And now knight takes d4, so black gets some trades going. Okay. Yeah, so UMOP saying that bishop b1 seems bad because a passive queen d2 followed by knight h6 seems more direct or easier. So yeah, UMOP, one of the yeah, so no pawn for you. Thanks for answering that for XKD2. It is against Kerry's, Paul Kerry's. And one of the possible ideas of bishop b1 is to reroute to a better diagonal. So although it may seem passive, hopefully that answers your question, what I was saying with a3, bishop a2. All right, knight takes d4. Feel free to ask some more questions, by the way. Knight takes on d4. And, okay, after knight takes d4, Rook takes c1. Bishop takes c1. So we get a lot of trades happening here, and e takes d4. Now, let's try to think of a plan in this position. I've actually also already seen the move. Yeah, I've already seen the move, so it's a little bit unfair, but let's see if we can find it together, and let's see if we can figure out not only why Fischer played it, but why the move is good. Okay. So first think of your own plans, and then I'll spoil the move for you guys. I'll let you guys first think of what you would do. Yeah, someone suggested queen to g4. It was race to gm, okay. Jamie says queen g4 allows knight h6. And there's implicit pressure on the d7 knight with queen to g4. Okay, so you want to go queen g4 and then knight to h6. Maybe what Fischer was thinking about is if he goes queen to g4 here, black might be able to play knight to e5. So let's look at that line. Queen g4, knight e5, knight h6, and king h8. Now, the key here is that this pawn is defended by the knight, and we're also attacking the queen as black. So this might be tricky. Yeah, Chess Patzer. We're analyzing Bobby Fischer's games in the hopes to try and play like him. So both. Yeah, Miss 95. Okay. So that idea that you guys suggested is actually a great one. But oftentimes when you see a good idea and then you see that your opponent has a way of refuting it, maybe either look deeper or try to switch up the move order. So you wanted queen g4, then knight h6. But what if we switched it up and did it the other way around? What if we did knight h6 first, and then if our opponent takes on h6, let me just promote this because this is what happened in the game. So yeah, if knight to h6, yep, race to gm, and g takes, now we go queen g4, and we do a fork on the knight and on the king. So by mixing up the move order, we have totally ruined black's pawn structure. And although we haven't really won anything, black's pawn structure is so damaged that it'll be easy for us to take advantage of. For example, these pawns are double isolated. This pawn is isolated. These pawns are double isolated. So just really, really bad pawn structure to the extent that it doesn't even matter that black is up a pawn here. And let's see how Fischer proves this. I keep knocking over the mic today. Oh my god. All right, so queen g4, queen takes d7. Now, whoa. His opponent plays bishop to d5. That's a pretty saucy move there, bishop to d5. And now the thing is, you can't take because there's a pin going on. So a very nice way to remaneuver. Okay, so that's a nice way to remaneuver. Bishop to d5. Queen to f5 is played to defend the pawn and attack the bishop simultaneously. Now we might be threatening some queen f6 stuff. All right. So queen to f5, and now black plays rook to e5, attacking the queen. Queen f3, and black is relentless. f5, he just keeps going. Taking advantage of all the pins in the position. So not only is this rook pinned, but the pawn is also pinned to the queen. So black taking advantage of every single pin. Bishop to f4, attacking the rook. Okay, now rook goes all the way back to e8. We still have this pin going, so still not a problem. Queen to h5, okay. Now, this game is all about pins, huh? So this is pinned, this pawn is pinned, but this pawn is also pinned to the bishop. So crazy amount of pins, crazy number of pins. Okay, queen to h5, bishop takes e4. Yeah, chess passer. I think cheers means Jack wants everybody to cheer with bits. I'm pretty sure that's what it means. Okay, bishop takes e4, black snags a pawn, and now Fischer goes f3, taking advantage of this pin. Very, very nice move. So if bishop takes on b1, we simply pick up the rook, and we actually fork the queen and the bishop. So black pretty much has to go bishop c6 if I'm not mistaken. Yep, bishop to c6. And now Fischer plays rook to c1. So you really want to play like queen takes f5 and threaten to mate over here. But you can't do it right away because he'll take with check. So to avoid that, you go rook to c1. And after bishop to d7, black is protecting this pawn. But you can take this one. Bishop takes on h6. And welcome to Mahoney Tay, who just followed. Welcome to the channel. Rook to e6. And bishop takes on f8. Okay, so we get a lot of trades going. Queen takes f8. Queen to h4. Now targeting this pawn. And what's pretty cool about this position is that same color bishops. So basically we're going to get a winning ending if we're up pawns. Mahoney Tay is a Notre Dame alum. Go Irish. Keenan Hall, class of 2012. Awesome. Yeah, I love it. I am Siegfried Hall, class of 23. Welcome to a fellow domer. That's so cool. All right, I'm getting distracted. So queen to h4 is the idea. Now queen to f6 is another dual purpose move, protecting the pawn and threatening a queen trade. Black is down in space, so he really wants to get some trades going. And his king side is also significantly weaker than white's king. So trades will be very helpful to black in alleviating some of the pressure. Very, very important. So queen to f6, queen takes f6, rook takes f6. Fischer decides that he can win the endgame, even though it does go in black's favor to get some trades going. Fischer decides that he's winning in this ending, so he's just going to go for it. And now king to f2. Just bring the king to the center of the board. Race to GM suggests rook c7 or rook to d1. Between those two, I'd probably play rook to d1, just try to pick up the d4 pawn. But Fischer just decides to go king f2 first, thinking that he's going to have this here whenever he wants it. King g7. And now Fischer plays your move, rook to c7. I'm not sure why not just rook d1 and take the pawn, but maybe he's got some bigger things planned, and he thinks he can win it anyways with the king. So this is one possible idea. Good suggestion by Race to GM. So rook to c7, and now rook to f7, and king e2. So yeah, white is trying to snake around and win the pawn with the king. Pawn to f4, trying to lock down the kingside pawns. These pawns on f3, g2, and h3 have now been immobilized, but the king and pawn ending should still be winning for white, as he can pick up these pawns if some significant trades happen. So, okay, rook comes to a7, king f6. So white is trying to target this. He does take it. Rook e7 check, and now the king has to move out of the way. So the king goes to f2. Here I would think about king d2 instead of king f2. I'm not sure why he goes... Okay. Oh, okay. He says that king d2 is refuted by rook g7. So this f4 move is actually super useful. Yeah, king d2, rook g7. Yep. So king f2 keeps an eye on this pawn. f4 is super useful then in that it wedges this pawn. Creates threats like rook to g7. Very nice. Okay. So the king goes to King goes to f2. Now bishop to e6. Okay, rook takes on d6 and king e5. So black is able to give up some material to fully activate the king. Very nice. So he activates the king. King e5, rook goes to c6, and bishop to d5. Okay. Rook goes to h6. Keeping an eye on the h7 pawn, making sure to keep this rook on e7 honest, and also making threats of rook to h5 check. So rook h6 is a good move. Rook to c7, rook h5 check, king to d6, rook h6 check, king to e5, and white plays around with a couple more checks, rook h5, king d6, and then he decides, no, I don't want the draw, and he goes rook to f5, and he plays for more. He's trying to win this pawn on f4, thinking that h7 will also be an easy target in the future. So he goes for this, rook to f5, which he gives a question mark, but he did really want to go for a win here. Rook c1, and now bishop to d3, getting the bishop out of dodge, just simply protecting it. Rook to d1, and now Fischer can protect the bishop and attack the rook with this king e2 move. Okay, so let's play through a couple more moves here. Rook g1, king f2, rook d1, king e2. So it looks like we have another threat of repetition. Rook to g1, and now rook g5. Okay, so Fischer declines a draw again, just repeating for whatever reason. Okay, so he goes rook to g5, and bishop takes on a2, which is given as a mistake because after bishop takes b5, this pawn is passed, and it's going to be a runaway train. Additionally, these two pawns are very weak. So black's pawns, which I noted earlier were significantly weak in the middle game, those weaknesses still persist in the endgame. So if your pawns are weak in the middle game, it's not going to be any better in the endgame. In fact, sometimes it's even easier to take advantage of weak pawns in the endgame than it is in the middle game. Yeah, Jamie likes that phrasing there. I got to be careful with my words. I used some phrase yesterday to describe like positional chess. I called it like choke chess or something, and then people were making fun of it. So I got to be careful. But okay, let's just continue here. Rook to b1, targeting this b pawn, and now king to d3, trying to win the d4 pawn. Pawn to h6, rook h5, trying to win this with check. Rook takes b2, king takes d4, and now we see a lot of trades, and white just ends up a pawn. Rook takes h6 check, king e7, and king to e4. Okay, and looks like this game was played back in a time when there were still adjournments. If you guys know what if you guys I got distracted looking at the comments about choke chess in the chat. Okay, let's forget about that. Let's leave that in the past. Yeah, if you guys know what adjournments are, basically, I don't know too much about it myself, but I know that back in the day, you used to get like a significant break in the middle of the game. So you'd be playing a game and then both players would just stop playing all of a sudden, and then you'd resume later, which would give teams time to prepare. There weren't really strong engines available at the time, so you just look at the board with your seconds, and you just try to think of what to do on your own, and then you'd come back to the board and play your ideas. So king e4, and it would suck to have an adjournment here, given that white's just up a pawn and he's going to try to find some way to win. So rook g5, and the bishop goes to a6. Okay, which is given a question mark. Kerry's thought that bishop to f1 was a better winning chance. I guess defending h3 so that you can snake around and win this pawn seems pretty reasonable. But bishop to a6, just moving the bishop out of dodge. I don't think there's any particular idea behind bishop a6, as if you're trying to control this square. Maybe you can try to come around bishop c8, bishop g4. This could be a good way to get everything defended. MC Vogt asking, why don't you just take the pawn with the king? If you take the pawn, then your bishop is hanging. So that's why you don't do that. Bishop to a6. Yeah, if you're new to chess, then the word pawn can sound a lot like pond, but it's P-A-W-N, pawn. We all start somewhere, though. Maybe that was a typo, but we all start somewhere. All right, so bishop to a6, and now bishop comes all the way back to f7. And we're going to see some wonderful technique. The idea that I was talking about, this bishop to c8. So I think white just really wants to consolidate these kingside pawns, pawn to f3, or the pawn on f3 and pawn on h3, and bishop g4 does exactly that, which now liberates our rook to come around and steal this e5 pawn somehow, or sorry, this f4 pawn somehow. So that's our idea with bishop to c8. Okay, rook to g6, offering a rook trade, and white declines. He says, I'm going to keep winning chances by not accepting your trade. If white did trade, so takes, king takes pawn. Now, all that black really has to do to make a draw is give up this bishop for this pawn, because this h pawn is not going to promote. So let me just give an example. Here, takes, and if you're an experienced chess player, you know this already, but for those of you who are closer to the beginner level, this pawn can't promote because your bishop can never give a check on this diagonal. That's the reason that this pawn can never promote. If you push it too far, then it's just going to be stalemate, and you can never use your bishop to try and win, because this is also stalemate. So lots of stalemate positions. All right, Jack, always with those jokes. Okay, so that position is not winnable. Let's go back to rook to h7, which is white's try at a win here. Rook h7 and king f8. Bishop comes back to g4. So he does solidify his position. No need to rush things. Rook g7, rook to h6. Still insisting on not trading. Fischer says white still can't afford to trade. Yep. So rook to g6. And now Fischer decides this is the perfect opportunity to trade the rooks, because now it's going to be hard for black to take this pawn. So this is my chance to win. Race to GM says he's got to go. See you later, man. Thanks for joining. Glad you enjoyed the stream. So takes, and now white can finally take this pawn. King g7, king g5. And if we notice, the big difference here is that it's not possible for black to sack the bishop right away. So white has very good winning chances. Yeah, no worries, MC Vogt. Totally understandable. It does sound very similar to Pond. No worries. UMOP says rook takes bishop. Bishop 2 pawns is greater than a rook, in my opinion. So you wanted to sack this rook for this bishop. If we can just trade the rooks, then that'd be the easiest way to win. Yeah, so now white just wants to push these. Whoa, my arrows are all over the place. We want to push these pawns, and ideally we don't want to allow a trade in which this bishop trades for this pawn. Otherwise, like I was mentioning earlier, it is a draw, because this pawn can never promote. So, okay, king to g5. Bishop to d3, and okay, Fischer plays f4, bishop e4, and we'll notice that Fischer does not play this move f5 because, like I said, the bishop sack results in a draw. So he doesn't want to do that. Instead, he goes h4 with the idea of pushing this guy. Maybe he'll bring the bishop to f5 in the future, place it on g6, and push for h6. This seems like a good winning plan as well. So Fischer goes h4, bishop d3, h5, bishop e4, and h6. Okay, so now the king is forced into the corner. If king to h7, now white can trade off the bishops and win. King to e6, and now we're winning by force with a simple little king trick. And now the pawn is promoting. So, okay. Instead, the black king goes to h8. What's up, Rowboat 2001? I know who that is, a friend from high school. What's up, Rohit? So king to h8, and now bishop to f5. Okay. And bishop f5 comes with the same idea of trading off bishops, looking for a win, trying to find a safe way to advance the f-pawn. So Fischer still faces this challenge. For those of you who are just joining, the same challenge persists, that we can never push this pawn if the bishop can sack for it. All right. So bishop to f5. I pawn my chess set. Welcome back. Bishop to f5. Now bishop d5. Okay. And bishop g6. So still finding a way. Still can't quite advance this pawn because it can be sacked for. All right. So bishop e6. And now king f6. Bishop c4. And Fischer's really trying to find a way to advance his pawn. So he finds this bishop to h5 move finally. And now he's threatening to go bishop g4, f5, f6. This is what he really wants to get in. So black goes bishop to c... Wait, hold on. No, black goes king h7, bishop to g4. The bishop trade results in a winning ending for white. So black can't go for that. Bishop c4 and f5. Okay. F5 is now free to advance because he's not able to sack for the pawn. Very important detail in this position. After bishop to f7, white simply goes f6. And black resigns in this position because white's idea is unstoppable. He just wants to go bishop f5, bishop g6, and win the game. The king can also come around once the bishop is on g6. And we get a pretty comfortable win. So, yeah, any sort of bishop g6 is just met with bishop to f5. Takes. Shoe Factory and Rowboat, do you guys know each other? No, I don't think so. So, yeah, white just wins this ending. So that was a good game. We've now gone through 8 Bobby Fischer games. We're spending about 30 minutes on each game, which is good. And I feel like we're learning a lot. We're getting some really instructive stuff in. So hopefully you guys feel the same way, that we're getting a lot of good education in here. If you are getting value from this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. 6 more subs and I buy the onesie. You can use the onesie command to check that out. But yeah, now I'm going to play some subs. I pawn my chess set, saying, damn, I just missed this one. I am going to post to YouTube. So I'm going to post both of these Bobby Fischer analysis ones.